courses on the history of the Middle East tend to be either front-loaded or back-loaded. Those that are front-loaded spend a lot of time on the 7th century and a lot of time in the 8th century. Then in the 9th century, they begin to taper off. And usually the professor says something like, I see that we're running out of time in this semester, so I will briefly talk about the 2 centuries before the Mongols. And then we'll assume that the Mongols just sweep up everything. The backloaded courses are the modern courses that start in the 18th century, sometimes the 16th century, and go through the 19th century in greater detail, and then go into the 20th century. But the problem is that you end up with a kind of gap between roughly 950 and 1750. That's sort of this 800-year hole where nobody really wants to study it or to lecture about it, and largely because the narrative disappears. You don't have a neat story of this ruler following that ruler, following this other ruler, has amazing anecdotes about him and his sister. It's just, no, you don't have that kind of storytelling that you can do, and instead you have what appears to be a confused situation. And in the writing of many historians, this confusion seems to be synonymous with a kind of decline. Decline is a taboo word in the study of Middle Eastern history, and has been for several decades now. Basically ever since Bernard Lewis wrote about decline, but then other European scholars wrote about decline. And the problem is that when the topic gets discussed, it's either explicitly stated or tacitly assumed that decline is something that may apply to political power, may apply to military power, may apply to economy, may apply to all sorts of things, but somehow it's rooted in culture or civilization, and that you have that if a culture has had a period of flourishing, and that period of flourishing has transformed into something else, that is somehow a cultural defect. And this has led to a very defensive position of people saying, no, Islam never declines, Islam simply grows from more to more, etc. And then you have other people, the notorious Orientalists, who say, no, it declines. And the big problem is, how do you deal with this period from 950 roughly to 1750, when you have an absence of a very clear central narrative. Now, in Ottoman history, starting in 1300, you do get a central narrative, but that peters out in the 1600s. And so it's a uniform lack of narrative. The Caliphate, of course, was the center of that narrative for the medieval period. You have an empire that is established in the 7th century, the first decade or so of the 8th century. It stretches from Spain to Pakistan. It is an empire ruled over by a central figure known as a caliph. And you have a succession of caliphs who belong to 2 families, first the Umayyad family, then the Abbasid family. And then somewhere after 833, it seems to come apart. You ask people to name the Abbasid caliphs, for example. They're pretty good up until al-Ma'mun, whose caliphate comes to an end in 833. Then it's sort of a guesswork, sort of like, what happened after Andrew Jackson? Okay, well, Martin Van Buren, fine, but oh my God, then we have Fillmore and Polk and Tyler Taylor. Who are these people? And then you say, finally, thank heavens, Abraham Lincoln came along, and we can have a history again. The political narrative, what I call the view from the center, simply cannot be allowed to stand as the sole or even the primary theme that you pursue in studying the history of Islamic society. If you follow the Caliphate and you find that the Caliphate loses power, the tendency is to say, well, there's something wrong with the Caliphate. If you look at it economically, you could say, well, there was a time when the tax revenues and the loot gained from conquest flowed pretty much into Baghdad, or before that into Syria when the Umayyads were ruling from Damascus. After the mid-800s, those revenues aren't coming to Baghdad anymore. People are carving off chunks of revenue and keeping them in provincial areas. If you look at the aggregate of urban culture and urban society, you can pretty easily make an argument that there is a great growth in the prosperity and the intellectual and social vitality of the Muslim community. It's just that it is now being divided into separate polities. That process of division starts basically in 755. In the year 740, the last powerful, well, not the last powerful, but the last adventurous Umayyad Caliph, whose name was Hisham, he sent an army to Morocco because there had been a revolt in 740 of somebody in Morocco. Who it was and what their fell purpose was is sort of lost in the legends of that time. But there was an army sent from Syria to Morocco, and the local rebels in Morocco sort of cleaned its clock, and the army was defeated, and they fled northward across the Strait of Gibraltar into Spain. Spain, of course, had been conquered in 711, but the Arabs and even more numerously the Berbers who had been part of that army simply settled in pieces of Spain that appealed to them. But now you had an army from Syria that was going into Spain and essentially assuming or trying to assume a certain amount of control. Then you get to 750. The Umayyad dynasty falls, the Abbasids come to power. The Abbasid family is pretty much wipes out the Umayyad family, but there's one member of that family, a grandson of the man who had sent the army in 740. His name is Abdurrahman. It's called Abdurrahman the immigrant, because he, after a whole elaborate story of daring do, which may or may not be true, he made his way to Spain, and he took over in Spain. And that's in 755. So after 755, you have the creation of a caliphate in Spain. That is an Umayyad caliphate. The caliph is a member of the Umayyad family, continuing, of course, what he considered to be the rightful tradition of the Umayyad family as caliphs. And from that time on, the caliphate that is being established in Baghdad never rules Spain. And this is the reason that the history of Islamic Spain really has a very different course than the history of Islam in other areas. In 809, there was an agreement, 803 I think it was, one of those years starts with an 80 something. There was an agreement made by which the governor in Tunisia, who was the primary Muslim commander and governor for North Africa, it was agreed that he would be able to pass on the governorship in hereditary fashion to members of his family in return for an annual tribute payment to Baghdad. Instead of having the taxes be collected and being sent to Baghdad as a proportion of the tax, was simply a flat sum. And in return, Baghdad washed its hands of North Africa. If you have Umayyads in Spain, well, you know who the Umayyads are. In Tunisia, you have the Ughlabids, because the man who made this deal had the euphonious name of Ughlab. Nothing you can do about that. Okay. So the Ughlabids are ruling in Spain, and they continue in North Africa, and they continue to rule there in Tunisia and Algeria, well, mostly in Tunisia, until 909. So they have a century or so of rule there, and it's quite prosperous. They are the ones who are primarily responsible for the conquest of Sicily, so that Sicily becomes part of the Muslim world, but not tributary to Baghdad and the Abbasid Caliphate, but rather relating primarily to this local dynasty in Tunisia. In Algeria, you have small states that become rebellious, rule themselves, have nothing to do with Baghdad, and there's a lot of debate and mythology about what exactly these states stood for, whether they were a sort of a metastasis into Algeria of rebellious things that had begun in southern Iraq and in Arabia, the Kharijite movement, or whether the Kharijite term is simply something that historians use to label rebels in North Africa. But I'm not going to go into who the Kharijites were or what was happening in Algeria. It's a really interesting story. But people who follow the Caliphate don't tell that story. Then you get into the 800s, and you start to have, from the 840s onward, a separate dynasty in southern Iran. They're known as the Saffarids. A Safar is a coppersmith, and so people, or a bronzesmith actually, so people sometimes make a big deal out of that, say, oh, he must be a proletarian or a craftsperson or something of that sort. We don't really know very much. The Saffarids expand into northern Iran, into Afghanistan, where they run into an enemy, local enemies in Central Asia, and these people are known as the Samanids, and they rule in Samarkand, Bukhara, places like that. In northern Iran, you have a dynasty that set up under an Abbasid general named Tahir. It's an Iranian. They're known as the Tahirids. And, you know, when you read Iranian history, this is really a key period, the rise of the independent Persian dynasties, because all of these rulers were native speakers of Persian, not of Arabic. And the Caliphate was unable to suppress these quasi-independent and independent dynasties. In the middle of the 800s as well, you have a Turkish general who is assigned to governor of Egypt, and he makes himself semi-independent there. His name is Tulun, or Ahmed ibn Tulun actually. And so he has a dynasty called the Tulunids, consists only of him and his son, and they rule Egypt for a period. And this is when you start to get more money being devoted to what becomes the city of Cairo after 969. I could list probably 6 others, smaller ones, of these local warlords or governors or military commanders who took control of some piece of property that had previously been part of the Caliphate. In each instance, the amount of money flowing into Baghdad is reduced, so that between, let's say, 840 and 911 or something like that, it appears that the tax revenues supporting the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad fell by what looks like about 71%. That probably is a little exaggerated because the earlier revenues were, we have no actual original documents about these financial things. We just have documents that are cited or referred to in later chronicles, and usually you'll have a statement of taxes from this period and from that period with nothing in between, so you don't know quite what to do with it. But every indication is that the revenues for Baghdad fell precipitately in this period of the late 800s. That doesn't mean that the Muslim society as a whole became impoverished. It simply meant that the money was being retained in the provinces, and as Baghdad becomes strapped for funds, other cities, whether it's Cordoba in Spain or Cairo, or what becomes Cairo, Fustat, in Isfahan, cities like in Iran, cities like Isfahan and Ray and Nishapur, cities in Central Asia like Bukhara and Samarkand. These cities are all growing, and they're all benefiting from investment. When you study history of Islamic art and architecture, you really don't look at the things being built in Baghdad. You look, partly because they've all been destroyed, but you're looking at the things being built from the, let us say, from the 800s onward in these other provinces. All of that building required investment, and that comes from whatever the tax base is in that locality. So you have this situation where you have a centralized state that had enormous wealth seems to become impoverished if you follow the narrative of the center, because by the time you get to the 900s, we have one caliph follows another. They're unable to pay the troops, so the troops rebel, and then a new caliph comes in and gives the back pay to the troops, but it's never enough, and then he gets booted out, and you have a succession of caliphs that is very unedifying. There's a wonderful book by Harold Bowen called The Life and Times of Ali ibn Isa, the Good Vizier, which is a detailed tale drawn from the chronicles of that period, which are abundant for Baghdad, about one particular administrator, and who alternated, he and his family alternated with another vizier, another family, and they would, when the caliph would appoint a vizier on the basis that the vizier would come up with the money to pay the troops, and then the vizier would come up with the money, but then he had to recoup the money because he'd spent all of his money to get the job as vizier. So he would imprison all of the administrators from the other faction and torture them until they told him where the money was. In those days, torture was largely beating people in the soles of their feet. Tie them down with their feet up, and you hit, and say, oh, I have a pot of money buried in my garden. Hit, oh, there's a pot of money buried elsewhere as well. And eventually, you collect several million dirhams, and you recoup your your losses. Well, now you know that that faction that you've just gotten the money from hasn't given up all their money. That they will go to the caliph or to a pretender to the caliphate and say, if you make me the vizier, I will pay off the troops and I will get the money back from the people I throw out of office. And you actually have a diwan, a section of government, devoted to getting money from fallen administrators. It was just assumed that they were all corrupt, that they'd all line their pockets and hid their money because they knew that they would be thrown out of office and they'd have to buy the way back in, and they would have to have their feet beaten and give up some of their money, but hopefully not all of their money. It's, if you want a history of institutionalized corruption, the Abbasid Caliphate in the early 900s is an excellent example. The army that needed all this money had also changed. And this is a change that begins with the caliphate of the brother of al-Ma'mun. Al-Ma'mun leaves the caliphate, dies in 833. His brother is named al-Mu'tasim. And al-Mu'tasim, if you recall, al-Ma'mun had a brother named Amin. He'd fought a civil war against Amin, and he'd won the war. Amin was killed, and Ma'mun ruled. But there was a third brother, and that is al-Mu'tasim. And al-Mu'tasim had been sort of left out of the calculations about the succession to the caliphate, but now that Amin was dead, and now that Ma'mun was dead, al-Mu'tasim comes to power. What al-Mu'tasim is noted for, in addition to continuing the mihna, the sort of loyalty test that al-Ma'mun had initiated at the end of his caliphate, what al-Mu'tasim is noted for is bringing Turkish troops into the army. These troops are different from the Arab tribal forces that you that you had at the time of the conquest, and different from the Persian troops that have been brought in with the Abbasid Revolution, and particularly with the rise to power of al-Ma'mun. The Turkish troops, instead of being a garrison or a army that was called upon to conduct a campaign, the Turkish troops lived in barracks 12 months of the year and had to be paid year-round. They did not have any other sources of income, and they were called Mamluks. This word, Mamluk, it literally means that thing that is possessed, a passive participle of melika, and Mamluks are usually described as slave soldiers. There has been a lot of debate about this. At a later period in Islamic history, in the 1240s, you have Turkish troops in Egypt who are clearly slave soldiers. They're clearly bought as non-Muslim slave boys, trained in barracks, and raised up to be professional soldiers, converting to Islam in the process. And those Mamluks of that later period seize power in 1250, rule for 10 years in the name of a nominal sultan, and then take power for themselves. And then take power for themselves in 1260. Those Mamluks continue to rule in Syria and Egypt until 1516, Then the institution continues under the aegis of the Ottoman Empire until 1811, when the Mamluks are defeated and you have a new regime in Egypt. In other words, when people talk about Mamluk history, they're usually talking about something that goes from 1240 to the 1240s down to the first decade of the 19th century. Very important phenomenon, and I'll certainly be talking about it more later. But the first Mamluks that come in the time of al-Mu'tasim, it's less clear where they come from. Some of them certainly were not slaves. Some of them clearly volunteered to be Mamluks. They came from other walks of life. The one common feature they had was that they were all Turks. And they all were, by Turks, it means they were speaking some Turkic dialect, although we don't necessarily know which one or which branch of Turks they all belong to. But what they formed was a separate military corps. A military corps that did not have allegiance to anyone else in the Caliphate, because there were no other Turks in the Caliphate. So they weren't like Arab tribes that have allegiance to their tribal confreres wherever they were. They weren't like the Persians that might have allegiance to one of these warlords in Iran. They weren't like North Africans who might have allegiance to some warlord in Egypt or North Africa. They were simply loyal to the caliph who bought them and trained them and paid them. And if they weren't paid, they became surly. The idea of having a military corps that is disconnected from the population at large continues to have an appeal in later Middle Eastern history. So that, for example, the military in Bahrain today is made up exclusively of Sunnis. That's fine. The Sunni minority dominates the Shiite majority. But they also have an internal police force that's made up entirely of Baluch tribesmen who are brought in from southern Iran, well actually western Pakistan, from Baluchistan. And the Baluch have no connections with the local population. In Oman, about half of the military is made up of Baluch migrants from western Pakistan. Some of them have been in Oman long enough to have families there, but they're disconnected from the local population. Now with the military agreement between the Saudi kingdom and Egypt, we may find the Egyptians playing a sort of military role in Saudi Arabia at some point, where they do not have any loyalties to to any of the existing factions of Saudi Arabia, except the king who pays for them and brings them in. This is not unusual in world history. Usually their mercenary groups are, they simply go to the highest bidder in complicated situations and they move from place to place. In the Middle East they tend to be in one place, partly because the training is essentially at the core of the Mamluk phenomenon. You're bringing in boys who are, at least where we know the details, boys who are, let's say, pre-adolescent or just adolescent, and you're putting them in a barracks and putting them under military discipline, and they become the best trained soldiers in the Islamic world, loyal to nobody except their paymaster as long as he has the money to pay them. The Mamluks, by and large, do not engage in jihad. They don't go off and try and expand the frontiers of Islam. They're there to protect the interest of the ruler. So they stay in the capital In the case of the Abbasid Caliphate, they built a new city that would be a garrison city for the Mamluks, that would be where the Caliph and his family lived, and you would have the Mamluks be the military there, leaving Baghdad to other military units. And that was the city of Samarra. Samarra is north of Baghdad on the east side of the Tigris River. And it was only occupied for a few decades, and then it was abandoned. This has been very fortunate for archaeologists, because now they have a medieval city that was abandoned in the 880s. And when they go there and they look at the architecture, they look at the pottery, they look at the decor and so forth of the surviving buildings that they can excavate, they can see here's what Islamic style looked like in the 850s to 880s, say. And therefore it's called the Samarra period. But the cost of building a separate city and designing it for a new army that was loyal only to itself and to its paymaster compounded the financial problems of the Abbasid Caliphate. So the Abbasids were clearly running out of money. And in 945, after a series of very messy political improvisations, essentially looking for a strongman, a family of mountaineers from northern Iran with their followers took over Baghdad. And they are called the Buyids, because their family name is Buyeh. They're also known in Arabic as Buwayhids, because the same word can be pronounced in Arabic Buway instead of Buyeh, and that fits Arabic grammar better than Buyeh, but it's a Persian name, so it's Buyid is the correct one. From 945 until 1050, these Buyids are controlling the Caliphate. The Caliph is still there. He doesn't have any power to speak of. He has a court, he has a vizier. He doesn't have an army under his control anymore. The Buyids have taken over. And the Buyids become simply one of these local warlord dynasties, ruling more from western Iran, from cities like Shiraz and Isfahan and Ray, than from Baghdad, they become sort of a secondary capital. All right, I've already spent more time on the politics than I want to, because it's all available in every standard history. And when you follow this, you take a caliphate and it dissolves, and it fractures into a number of small localized successor dynasties that each has a separate history. It becomes too much to follow. And so most professors prefer to just deal with the earlier period. But there are other ways to look at this. Because what is happening isn't simply a matter of politics. It certainly isn't a matter of culture. In fact, Baghdad is probably more of a cultural center in the 900s than it was in the early 800s. It is still the place to go. If you're a philosopher or an artist or a theologian, a legist, Baghdad is a great city. It's just that it is a great city that is being ruled by a dynasty that's run out of money. This sometimes seems inconsistent. How can you have a flourishing period? There was a German scholar named Adam Metz who referred to this period of the late 800s, 900s as the Renaissance of Islam. because there's so much cultural flowering. But how can you square that with the evidence of all sorts of political and economic distress? And of course, it turns out that comparatively in history, there are numerous periods when cultural flowering follows a period of economic distress. Most notably, 1348, you have the Black Death that devastates Europe and kills half the population of Italy, and then you get the Renaissance. And at the time of the Renaissance, Italy is in chaos in terms of political factions and fighting and so forth and so on, but enough of the money has stuck in each little principality that they can foster artworks and commemorate their own lives as rulers. We get the same thing here, that Baghdad still had a lot of money, and it still had a lot of culture, but the political and the military situation steadily deteriorated. In portraying this as a result of the decentralization that came when warlords took over separate provinces, and that's the usual way to portray it, it disguises other things that were going on in the economy. So I want to return now to some of the economic issues that I talked about earlier on. And let's take Baghdad proper. Now, here you have the Tigris River comes down like that, Euphrates River comes down like that. Baghdad is located here at the point where the Tigris and the Euphrates come most closely together. Babylon was right over here, Kufa over here earlier. This is the natural place in Iraq to have a metropolitan center because you can draw on the resources of both river valleys. And you do that because you have canals that go from the Euphrates to the Tigris, because the land elevation of that time was such that the Euphrates was at a higher level slightly than the Tigris. So Baghdad was built as a round city. You had a round city like this, gates, and then the palace of the Caliph and the Grand Mosque were out here in the center of a very large interior courtyard. So it's a donut-shaped city, and then you had lanes all along here, radial lanes and cross streets, and the army lived there. The general population did not live in the round city. It's called the round city of El Mansur because Mansur was the caliph when it was built in the late 750s. So what you had was that canals from the Euphrates to the Tigris over here, these canals would go north and south of the round city, and the popular areas grew up to the north and the south. So you had the caliphal center in the round city. We don't know when the round city disappeared. No archaeological trace of the round city has ever been found. It is described minutely in medieval texts, so we can diagram it. We can write about its history, but in time, the round city gets absorbed into these popular quarters to the north and south of it. And then at an even later point, new palaces and quarters extend over to the east side of the Tigris. So Baghdad is not an easy topography to dope out and to define periods for. Nevertheless, Archaeologically, Baghdad appears to be 10 times larger than any of the previous capitals of Iraq that were built in the same general location. During the Sassanid Empire that preceded Islam, the capital was over here just on the southern outskirts of Baghdad. It was a site called Ctesiphon. But whether it's Ctesiphon or any of the other several capitals that were in that same locale, Baghdad was 10 times larger. And how big it was, we don't know. Some people feel that 1 million is a realistic number. Other people think that it's implausible. But how big it was, in absolute terms, is irrelevant when you're looking at it in relative terms, of it being so much bigger than any previous city in this crucial area where the Tigris and Euphrates flow near each other. How do you feed 1 million people or 500,000 people? Much less 2 million. I mean, the estimates vary greatly. Not much of anybody that goes under 500,000. Well, the problem of feeding a large urban population is a universal problem in pre-modern times. And by and large, it requires that you be on navigable water. You have to be able to bring in foodstuffs by water because the cost of bringing in foodstuffs overland is so enormous. In the Roman period, it was figured that if you were carrying a load of wheat, say, a load of grain, from one place to another by ox cart, that you doubled the cost every 100 miles. So that's simply the cost of the vehicle, the animals, the driver, and so forth and so on, and tolls presumably. So the question was, how do you feed a city that large? An archaeologist at the University of Chicago many years ago took a team of students and they walked the terrain, particularly the terrain out here east of Baghdad. There's a river valley, a tributary of the Tigris, called the Diyala Valley. And there are canals that go off the Diyala and then flow back into the Tigris. So this is prime agricultural land. So they walked this terrain, and really you're here and there's a guy here, a guy over there. I mean, you're walking at systematically as a team, and you're looking at the ground and you're picking up potsherds as you go along. And you're making note of where in your territory you get the potsherds. When you find potsherds, broken bits of pottery, that fall into a diagnostic category, then you say, okay, this pot must have been broken here under such and such a ruler. Because pottery tends to be comparatively uniform in certain characteristics within a particular time period. So here you have Iraq, which has been inhabited, urban settlements since 3000 BC. So you could make maps. You could say, where were the villages in 2500 BC? Where were the villages in 1000 BC? Where were the villages in 500 AD? And you can not only identify where the villages were, but you can then look around and see, for that type of pottery, how big an area is occupied. So you can say how big the village was. We're not talking about excavation. We're just talking about surface surveys. And then when you lay it out on a map and you see that you have a line of villages, then you infer that there was a canal that went along next to those villages. And the canal's disappeared, though sometimes you can pick it up on aerial photographs. The result was that in a book called Land Behind Baghdad, Robert McCormick Adams laid out certain empirical evidence for what happened with Baghdad. And it's very suggestive. In the 400 years before the rise of Islam, under the Sassanid dynasty, and they had their capital right there on the southern outskirts of Baghdad, on the east side of the river. During that time, they found pottery evidence of around 400 villages. For the earlier period, the so-called Parthian period, the same area had less than half the number of villages. So people concluded that the Sassanids were more prosperous, had more production than their predecessors. Then you come to the beginning of the Caliphate, and this is where it becomes difficult to interpret. At the very beginning of the Caliphate, the number of villages seems to plummet, and it seems that maybe half the villages are no longer occupied. And so the idea came about, well, the villages must have been abandoned, therefore there must have been political chaos at the time of the conquest, and the villages are abandoned. The problem is all the people came back, and the villages become numerous again in the early Abbasid period. It's awkward because the villages earlier on appeared to overlap from dynasty to dynasty, whereas in the transition from the Sassanids to the Muslims, the villages seem to be in new locations, but often in a location right next to where the old village was. In other words, you start getting village successions that alternate. Pre-Islamic, Islamic, pre-Islamic, Islamic, pre-Islamic, Islamic. And of course the interpretation of that I have is that the notion that this pottery reflects the political leadership is probably wrong. It reflects the lifestyles of people, and the Muslims start to adopt different lifestyles. And so when people convert to Islam, they go to where the Muslims are, and they start a new village, leaving the old pottery styles and the old lifestyle of the Christians and the Jews and the Zoroastrians in the village that they depart from. So if you factor that in, then instead of saying that there was a catastrophe at the end of the Sassanid period, all the villagers left, and then things were prosperous in the early Abbasids, all the villagers came back, you wonder where did they go? Did they say, well, let's just take a break and wait 50 years because I'm sure a dynasty will come along, they'll be more prosperous. It's easier to understand it as a matter that the pottery record is affected by the changes in style that are accompanied by the growth of a Muslim population. I've argued before that, say in the growing of cotton in Iran, that you had a contest between Muslims who were wearing plain white cotton or plain black cotton versus the non-converted Iranian elite who wore silk brocade, and that you had a visual contrast. Well, I think that contrast carried down to pottery levels and lifestyles in Iraq as well, and that there was a way that the Muslims lived that was different, deliberately different, that would set them apart from the way that the unconverted population was. So if you make these various adjustments, it looks as though production declined in the Islamic period over what it had been under the Sassanids, but not catastrophically. And it appears that a great deal of the food being consumed in Baghdad was the result of new enterprise, not in the Diyala Valley, right next to Baghdad, but rather in eastern Syria, the area that ISIS now controls, which for the first time becomes a major agricultural area and exports wheat and other products to Baghdad, floating them down the river. This is consonant with the idea that there were certain economic enterprises that were associated with new conversions to Islam. In Iran, you convert to Islam and you start growing cotton. In Syria, Eastern Syria, you convert to Islam, you start growing wheat. That this investment was an aspect of the government or the individual entrepreneurs being Muslims. And it was also related to the fact that I mentioned earlier that Islamic law gave ownership of land to people who brought desert land under cultivation. The result is that up until the late 800s, it's very confusing. But it appears that there was enough production to support a large city, although a lot of that production was far to the north in Syria rather than there in Iraq. There is a question of where did the people in Baghdad come from? Many of them must have come from the surrounding villages. And if they came from the surrounding villages, did that leave a labor shortage in those villages? This becomes crucial as you get into the 900s in particular, because we have records of canals and dikes and dams being destroyed in military operations, and then they don't appear to be repaired. Some people say, well, the government did not pay attention, was not conscientious in repairing damages done to the irrigation system. But I think it's more plausible to think that they didn't have the manpower to do it, and that they were simply running into a rural labor shortage. Whatever the case, after 880 or so, in other words, after the Samara period, there appeared to be a huge decline in the agricultural production of the Diyala Valley outside of Baghdad. Most of the villages disappear, and between the 880s and 1200, a long period of time, I think there are only 26 new villages recorded. So something is going terribly wrong with the economy. And this is apart from the issue of revenues being held by warlord dynasties in Egypt or North Africa or parts of Iran. The central economy is falling apart. That probably has more to do with the budget problem of the Caliphate than what's going into the hands of the warlords in the provinces, because that central part of Iraq had always been a very productive area in terms of taxation. So when the taxes fall, they're falling overall because of monies being sequestered elsewhere, but they're falling even in the central area. You have some evidence of changes in the taxation, and in Iran in particular, where we have some tax rates that are given, it seems that with a series of tax records that going from the 800s into the 900s, that the rate of taxation for wheat and barley steadily falls, whereas the taxation rate for cotton remains high. Well, if most of your agricultural production is in grain and your taxation is primarily based upon the crops that are being grown, why do you reduce the tax rate on grain? And the answer that I've suggested is that the cities that were growing were outgrowing the labor productivity of the countryside. That you had these marvelous cities, and productive cities and cities full of cultured, literate people producing one of the most dynamic intellectual environments in world history. But they were running out of food. Cotton was a particularly offensive product in that regard because you can't eat it. It takes up a lot of acreage, takes up a lot of labor, but it doesn't produce any food. There's a later point in Iranian history in the 19th century where a governor, at the time when Iran is producing opium for sale to China, a governor declares that, for every acre of opium you plant, you must plant an acre of wheat because we don't have any food. So there's some indication that they were using tax policy to try to keep food supplies high. Pinning down exactly where these problems occurred is difficult. I worked mostly on Iran and on Baghdad. It's not necessarily the same everywhere. Egypt has a totally different system based on the flooding of the Nile. Spain is, again, a totally different area. Sicily, a totally different area. But it is remarkable when you compare the size of the cities in the Islamic lands with the size of the cities in Europe. It's remarkable how small the European cities are. They appear to be, 9 to 12% maybe of the population in a given area, the main cities. Whereas in the Islamic lands, you may go up to 20% of the population living in major cities. And what makes that even more remarkable is that some of these big cities, in fact, many of the big cities, are not on navigable water. So that none of the big cities of Iran can bring in foodstuffs by water. The big cities of Syria, Damascus, Aleppo, they don't bring in food by water. Baghdad could, Cairo could. Kairouan, the main city of Tunisia, was inland. It did not have water transport. So transportation becomes a crucial issue because that's what adds to the cost of supporting the population. I may be the only person who believes this, but I think that by the 900s, you had a society that was in a state of spectacular productivity in almost every area of cultural expression, but was on the edge of catastrophe in terms of its economic infrastructure. There is very little evidence that any government in any area took serious measures to address the economic problem. What you did have was the creation of a new type of revenue, and this type of revenue has been debated by historians a lot. You had an iqta. An iqta is from a verb in Arabic, qata, meaning to cut off, to cut. And what it is a cutting off of some segment of the revenue production of the state and assigning it to a particular individual. Typically, that assignment will go to either a member of the administration, a high-ranking person in the administration, or increasingly we go to a military man. So that someone who had an iqta would be told, you should live on the revenues that you collect from this piece of land that we've assigned to you. Initially, when this was beginning in the mid-800s, it appears that there was some sort of central control. But as time goes on, it appears that the possession of a land assignment becomes increasingly sort of self-enforcing. Not that the commander himself goes out to the countryside and collects taxes, but rather that he sends his agents to collect the taxes. The debate among historians, and it starts at this time with the Iqta. It continues on into the Ottoman Empire, into the Persian Empire, into the Mughal Empire in India. It goes on for hundreds of years. The debate among historians is whether this system of land assignments intrinsically led to the destruction of the productivity of the land, because the holder of the Iqta would simply collect as much as he possibly could, or whether by assigning this to a particular landholder, that landholder then took responsibility to be an entrepreneur and to build the productivity of the land. Very often, an Iqta was compared with a fief in European history, but there are differences. And the word fief has become less commonly used for medieval European history than it once was, because historians have found so much variation in the so-called feudal system that some of them have quit using the word feudal system altogether, which is very unfortunate for people who borrowed the word from Europe, and now they say, oh, feudal Japan. How can you have feudal Japan when there's no feudal Europe? Very confusing. But in any case, as I talked about earlier, in the pre-Islamic period, the minor gentry of Iran lived on their land and had a manor house, and they had feasting and hunting, and they used silver vessels, and they lived in the produce of their own land. In Europe, that is pretty much the way the lords lived. If you go back to the 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th centuries, they lived on their land, and they gained their livelihood from the production of land, and some of them were very concerned with the productivity of the land. In the case of the Iqta, it seems to be unusual for an Iqta holder to actually live on the land. They continue to live in Baghdad or in Cairo or whatever city the ruler is in, who has appointed the land to them, and they simply live on the revenues. So some historians have argued, well, that means that they don't have a vested interest in being entrepreneurial with regard to the land, and that this leads to a deterioration of production. And the argument over the value or the damage associated with Iqta holding has gone on for a very long time. Now, what has arisen more recently is the issue of climate change, and the plausibility of an argument that the reason the land wasn't producing so much was because the climate was getting bad. This is primarily, my thesis in my book on cotton, climate, and camels. And then an Israeli scholar, Ronnie Ellenberg, has written a book called The Collapse of Civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean, which kind of takes my evidence and says, sort of catastrophizes it. But he adds other information dealing with Syria and Egypt, a little less convincing. And there is now a really impressive amount of information that climate historians for the Byzantine Empire are working on, showing that at the time when you had severe cooling of the climate in Iran and Iraq, and I propose that was also happening in eastern Anatolia, Armenia. Now the Byzantine historians are proving that this was a period of very, very cold and dry weather in eastern Anatolia, and that you had huge problems there, and that this ultimately contributed to the coming of the Turks into Anatolia and the defeat of the Byzantine Empire in that area. So there are now a number of historians that are beginning to converge upon this question of to what degree the change in the climate brought about a decline, or in my thinking, tipped the urban-rural balance in favor of or tipped it against the maintenance of large cities. The cities from the 900s, let's say from 900 through to 1200, most of the large cities experience radical shrinkage, particularly in the 1000s. By radical shrinkage, some of them seem to fall by maybe 80% in population. That is to say, you can look at the walls that they once had and then look at the walls they had at a later point, and you see a shrinkage. The city of Baghdad, when you look at the best history of Baghdad by a modern scholar, Guy Lestrange's History of Baghdad, he has maps. He starts with the round city of Al-Mansur in here, and it builds and builds, but then by the time you get to 1000 or so, his map shows a series of satellite towns on the outskirts of ruins, so that Baghdad increasingly became destroyed in its center. In the Chronicles, we read about fires, because fires, of course, were devastating in pre-modern situations. Nobody had the means to put out the large fires. We read about flood damage, because the Tigris floods very severely in the spring. But what we don't read about is rebuilding. Or if there is rebuilding, it appears to be real rebuilding on the outskirts, rather than going into the center of the city and trying to clear it out, restore it, and rebuild in the way it was. So that Baghdad occupies a huge area, but much of that area by 1000, in the course of the 11th century, comes to be, consists mostly of ruins. The ruins are curious. You know, when you go to a ruined city, just to see walls that are sort of semi-standing and, you know, over large areas, and say, well, there was a city here once. You know, in Nishapur, I would stand and I'd say, well, between me and those mountains, there were once 100,000 people, and now it's just humps of land and, you know, plowed fields and so forth and so on. It's very hard to visualize the process by which a large city turns into a field of ruins. But the cost of going in, leveling the land, rebuilding is enormous, and somebody has to bear those costs, and there was no money to do that. So why the money wasn't there, as I say, is uncertain, but I think the climate plays a significant role in this. In 926, Baghdad in January had a severe cold snap that lasted for several weeks. And it is interesting the way in which these get described, because of course one of the things you're afraid about when you read a story like this in the Chronicle is that they say, well, there was bad weather, and that's sort of a metaphor for the government being corrupt or something, that you're using catastrophes as comments on the political situation. But one of the things that suggests that that is not the case is when they talk about cold, not having thermometers, because the thermometer had not yet been invented. They talk about the cold in terms of what things froze, because different fluids freeze at different temperatures. They knew that there were, water would freeze before wine. And so they would say it got so cold that the wine and the urine and the rose water froze. And so they knew that there were degrees of cold. In 1007, in November, Baghdad had 1.5 feet of snow, and it stayed on the ground for days. In November, Baghdad hasn't had any snow that stayed on the ground for the last 200 years since we've started keeping modern records. So these anecdotes accumulate, and you can see these periods. The 920s were terrible, and then you get into the early 1000s, and you have consistently, or at least recurrently, bad weather that goes on for over a century. And this is particularly made clear in the Byzantine evidence. We run out of chronicles that are very expressive by the late 1000s, early 1100s for the Baghdad area, but for the Byzantine area, we still have a lot of chronicle material. Plus, they now have a lot of pollen studies and tree ring studies that support the notion of this climatic collapse. What happens when the climate goes bad? I remember years ago teaching a seminar with a colleague who was a political scientist. One of my students who had done this tabulation of all this bad weather said, here's my seminar paper, it's about bad weather in Baghdad. And my political science colleague said, what did that mean? What difference did it make? And he replied, it's just interesting. He said, well, that's not an academic paper. You have to have a thesis, you have to have a dependent variable, an independent variable, you have to have a certain thing. There's no point writing something just to find out what it is. But, that's political scientists versus historians perhaps, but the fact of the matter is that his collection of data proved to be crucial in my own work 20 years later, and I'd been looking for all that time for corroborative scientific evidence to support the idea of a climatic collapse. And now that evidence is becoming increasingly available. So we have an interesting situation whereby the Middle East, A, becomes cold, B, that does something to the agricultural economy, and then C, Europe at precisely this time experiences some of the warmest weather it would have for hundreds of years. And so you get a big demographic shift. The population of the Middle East over the period of the late 900s down to the 1200s, the population of the Middle East declines. It's cold, it's unproductive, it's economically in a terrible situation. And the population of Europe increases. They have lots of rainfall, they have crop expansion, and you have one of the great historic shifts from a productive Islamic world and a, let us modestly say, an unproductive Christian world. And now it shifts. And you're getting the roots of the Renaissance and the growth of Europe coinciding with this collapse of things in the Middle East. So the question is, can we use the word decline? And what I'm trying to argue for here is that if you stick to empirical stuff and to economics, climate, and things like that. And you do not suggest that culture is what causes this decline. Then I think it's quite legitimate, because this period of decline is also a period of enormous intellectual and artistic production. But in the long run, the big shifts of demography and the big shifts of economic vitality are what tell the tale for the subsequent centuries.